For decades, George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, kept many of his thoughts locked away, choosing peace over controversy and reflection over confrontation. Yet, behind that calm exterior lay stories, friendships, and heartbreaks the public never fully understood. One of those untold stories involved a man few expected to be part of Harrison's inner circle, Lewis Collins, the charismatic British actor best known for his tough guy role in The Professionals. In the 1970s and early 80s, both men were icons in their own right. George, the spiritual rock legend seeking balance after the chaos of Beatlemania, and Lewis, the rugged television hero whose intensity on screen mirrored his boldness off it. They met under unlikely circumstances, bonding over their shared fascination with meditation, music, and the strange world of celebrity fame. But their friendship, though genuine, wasn't without turbulence. Both men were outsiders in their own industries, too independent, too outspoken, too different to fit comfortably into the molds expected of them. And over time, a misunderstanding would drive them apart, leaving behind silence that lasted for decades. Now, years after Lewis Collins' tragic passing in 2013, George Harrison's long-hidden reflections on their connection have resurfaced through friends, old interviews, and letters, revealing a side of both men few ever saw. This isn't just a story about two famous figures. It's a story of ego and humility, of fame and regret, and of how one man's spiritual awakening brought him face to face with the ghosts of his past. Because when George Harrison finally broke his silence on Lewis Collins, the truth was both heartbreaking and beautiful. It was the late 1970s, an era when fame in Britain felt almost mythical. George Harrison, weary from the chaos of Beatlemania, had stepped away from the blinding spotlight to focus on what he called real life. He was diving into spirituality, gardening, and film production through his company Handmade Films. His days of frantic touring were behind him, replaced by quiet reflection and the search for peace. Meanwhile, Lewis Collins was living almost the opposite existence. As the breakout star of the hit British series The Professionals, Collins was every bit the action hero. Fast cars, gunfire, stunts, and swagger. He embodied danger, charm, and rebellion. Off camera, however, he was far more complex, intelligent, introspective, and constantly pushing against the limitations of fame. Their worlds should never have collided. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. In 1979, during a charity event in London that brought together musicians and television personalities, George and Lewis met for the first time. According to one mutual friend, the introduction was instant chemistry, not romantic, but spiritual. They were both searching for something beyond the fame, the friend later recalled. George saw in Lewis the same restless soul he once saw in himself. Lewis, known for his bold personality, surprised everyone by speaking to George not about music, but about peace. He'd recently started practicing meditation and studying Eastern philosophy, inspired by Harrison's earlier journey with the Maharishi. "I've been reading about transcendence," Lewis reportedly told George that night, "but I don't know if I'm doing it right." George laughed softly and said, "There's no right way. Just keep listening." That small exchange marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship, one built on mutual respect and the shared understanding that fame, no matter how bright, often casts dark shadows. Over the following months, they stayed in touch. George invited Lewis to Friar Park, his estate in Henley-on-Thames. Away from cameras and noise, Lewis experienced something rare, quiet. The two spent hours walking the gardens, playing acoustic guitars and talking about everything from music to mortality. George admired Lewis's depth. "He wasn't what people thought," he told a friend later. Behind that tough exterior was a man who wanted to understand life. But their friendship wasn't without challenges. Lewis was known for his strong opinions, especially about the entertainment industry. He often vented frustrations about typecasting and creative control, things George understood all too well from his time in the Beatles. "They box you in," Lewis said once during dinner. "They love what you give them, but they won't let you grow." George nodded knowingly. "That's why you have to build your own box." Their connection deepened through these quiet conversations. George began helping Lewis with small musical projects, while Lewis appeared in social circles tied to Handmade Films, the company George founded. For a brief period, they were kindred spirits, two men from very different worlds, who somehow understood each other better than anyone else did. But as the 1980s began, the pressures of fame, ambition, and ego started to creep in. George was stepping deeper into film production, while Lewis wanted to break into Hollywood, a move George privately warned him against. "It'll chew you up, mate," George said. But Lewis was determined. He wanted more. More success, more roles, more recognition. When Lewis left for Los Angeles, the distance between them wasn't just physical. It marked the beginning of a slow, silent drift, one that neither man would address for years to come. And as George would later admit, sometimes when you don't say goodbye properly, the silence stays longer than it should. By the early 1980s, Lewis Collins had gone from being Britain's favorite television hero to an ambitious actor determined to conquer Hollywood. His confidence, often mistaken for arrogance, made him a difficult figure in the industry. While the professionals had turned him into a household name, it also trapped him in a character he could never quite escape. He was desperate to be taken seriously, to prove he could be more than just the gun-toting tough guy. George Harrison, on the other hand, had already walked that path. He'd known the dangers of fame's illusion, the way success can inflate one's ego while quietly destroying one's peace. He had retreated from the public eye, choosing a quieter life filled with music, gardens, and spirituality. To him, Lewis's Hollywood dream felt like a dangerous mirage. When Lewis told George over dinner that he planned to move to Los Angeles to go big, George's reaction was uncharacteristically blunt. "You'll lose yourself over there," he warned. "The business doesn't love anyone. It just uses them." But Lewis brushed it off. He wanted to chase the dream, to prove everyone wrong. "You made it through it," he told George. "Why can't I?" George smiled gently but said nothing. Deep down, he knew that fame was a test few survived intact. Once Lewis settled in LA, things began to unravel. The roles he wanted didn't come easily. Hollywood saw him as too British, too intense. Frustrated, he started calling George less frequently. When they did speak, the conversations were short and uneasy. George would ask, "Are you happy?" Lewis would change the subject. The final straw came during a film pitch meeting that George attended through Handmade Films. According to one insider, Lewis had hoped George could help him secure a role. But the producers weren't interested. And when George suggested patience, saying, "Timing is everything," Lewis, "Let it come naturally." Lewis took it as pity. He thought George didn't believe in him, a friend later revealed. He felt betrayed. After that, Lewis cut off contact. Months passed without a call, then years. George, who valued peace over confrontation, didn't chase the friendship. He simply let it go, believing that if fate wanted them to reconnect, it would happen. But the silence hurt. During a private interview in the late 1990s, when asked about lost friendships, George said softly, "Sometimes you meet people who are like mirrors. They show you who you used to be. When the mirror breaks, it's hard to look at what's left." Lewis, for his part, spoke briefly about George in one of his final interviews. "He was one of the few people who really saw me," he said. "But I think I scared people away. Maybe I was too intense for my own good." Behind those words was regret. The same fire that made Lewis a captivating performer also made him difficult to love. And George, ever the quiet observer, understood that. He had this light, George told a close friend years later, but he didn't know how to protect it. When Lewis's Hollywood dreams eventually crumbled, he retreated from the spotlight entirely. He turned toward private business ventures and focused on his family. George, by then, was spending his final years away from fame, surrounded by his wife Olivia and son Danny. Neither man ever reached out again. The friendship that had once been full of laughter, music, and mutual respect had become just another silent chapter in two extraordinary lives. Yet, as fate would have it, that silence wouldn't last forever. When George Harrison's reflections on Lewis Collins resurfaced years later, the world would finally learn the truth, not of bitterness, but of forgiveness and understanding. As the 1990s drew to a close, George Harrison had fully retreated from the whirlwind of fame. Living quietly at Friar Park, he surrounded himself with gardens, instruments, and only a few trusted friends. To outsiders, he was the Beatle who disappeared, but to those close to him, he was simply George, a man still trying to understand life's mysteries, still writing songs about love, loss, and the soul's journey. Yet, in those quiet years, certain memories never faded, one of them being Lewis Collins. Though they hadn't spoken in years, George often mentioned him in passing, especially when conversations turned to fame and how it changes people. "Lewis had that hunger," he told a journalist once. "It's what makes you great, and what breaks you too." George's friends recalled that Lewis represented something deeply personal for him, a reflection of his own younger self. The same restless ambition, the same desire to escape expectations. "It's funny," George once said with a faint smile. "When I was Lewis's age, I was trying to find peace. He was trying to find purpose. We were both lost in different directions." In 1999, during one of his last in-depth interviews, George spoke about the people who had come and gone in his life. Without naming names, he said, "Some friends drift away, but that doesn't mean the love goes with them. You can forgive in silence." That's a kind of prayer too. Many now believe that comment was about Lewis. Around that same time, George began writing a series of reflective letters, mostly to himself, about the people who had shaped his journey. In one undated page found among his personal papers after his passing, he wrote, "We don't always get to say sorry. But maybe the soul doesn't need words. I hope he's found peace, the kind that took me years to understand." Those who read the note later said there was no doubt he was referring to Lewis Collins. Meanwhile, Lewis had quietly left acting behind. By the 2000s, he was living a private life with his wife and children, far removed from the fame that once consumed him. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, he spoke of his career with a mix of pride and melancholy. "I had my shot," he told one reporter. "Maybe I was too stubborn. Maybe that was my curse." What he didn't know was that George had been keeping an eye on him from afar. Through mutual acquaintances, George learned that Lewis had mellowed, that he was happier, more at peace. "That's all I ever wanted for him," George told a friend. When George Harrison passed away in 2001, Lewis Collins reportedly sent a private letter to George's widow, Olivia, expressing his sorrow and admiration. "He was the most sincere man I ever met," Lewis wrote. "He saw through the noise of the world. I wish I'd told him that before it was too late." Olivia never made the letter public, but she confirmed its existence years later, saying, "Lewis's words were heartfelt. George would have smiled." That simple exchange, one man gone, another left behind, became the final thread connecting them. For George, forgiveness had already happened in silence. For Lewis, it came too late to be spoken aloud. But between them, there remained something that transcended time and misunderstanding. Respect, gratitude, and the unspoken love of two artists who had recognized themselves in each other. In those last years, George often said, "People come into your life like lessons. Some stay, some go, but they all teach you something about yourself." And perhaps, more than any other, Lewis Collins had taught him the most. For years after George Harrison's passing in 2001, Lewis Collins remained publicly silent. The media reached out, fans speculated, and journalists hoped he would open up about their mysterious friendship, but Lewis avoided the topic completely. "It's not my story to tell," he once told a reporter. "Some memories are too sacred to turn into headlines." But as time passed and age caught up with him, Lewis began to reflect more openly on the people who had truly mattered in his life. And George was one of them. In a 2010 interview, long after the cameras had stopped following him, Lewis finally spoke about his connection to the quiet Beatle. His voice trembled as he said, "George was unlike anyone I ever met. He had this way of seeing right through you. Not judging, just understanding. When he talked, it felt like he was listening to your soul." The interviewer pressed further, asking if there had been any tension between them, as rumors had long suggested. Lewis paused before responding. "Of course there was. We were both proud, both stubborn, Both thought we had it all figured out. And that's why we clashed. But looking back now, I see that what I mistook for distance was wisdom. George wasn't pulling away. He was letting me grow up. Those words revealed more than anyone expected. It was clear that their friendship had gone deeper than casual acquaintance. They had challenged each other, inspired each other, and, in some ways, hurt each other too. Lewis went on to describe a moment that had stayed with him for decades, the last time he ever saw George in person. It was at a gathering in the late 80s, he recalled. He looked thin but peaceful. I remember him putting his hand on my shoulder and saying, "We all end up where we're supposed to." I didn't understand it then. Now I do. After that encounter, they lost touch. But when George passed away, Lewis reportedly isolated himself for days. A close friend later revealed he couldn't stop talking about him. He said he wished he'd written to George, that he'd said the things he never got around to. In a rare appearance at a charity event in 2012, Lewis was asked again about George. This time he smiled softly and said, "He forgave me long before I forgave myself." That's the kind of man he was. Behind those words lay years of quiet guilt and an even deeper gratitude. Not long after, Lewis himself began facing health struggles. Friends said he became increasingly introspective, often spending hours listening to George's solo music, especially songs like "All Things Must Pass" and "Beware of Darkness." He once confided, "Those songs sound different when you're older." You realize he was talking to all of us, not as fans, but as souls. When Lewis Collins passed away in 2013, one of the few personal items displayed at his private funeral was a small photograph of George Harrison. Taken in the mid-1970s, both men smiling, relaxed, and far from the spotlight. No captions, no fame, just two friends, frozen in a moment of genuine peace. A family friend later shared that Lewis had written a note tucked inside the photo's frame. It read simply, "Thank you, my friend. You taught me more in silence than the world ever could in words." That note, like George's own reflections years earlier, revealed the quiet truth behind their complicated bond. Two artists, one a Beatle, the other a rebel who lived, learned, drifted apart, and ultimately found understanding beyond time and ego. Their friendship never needed public validation. It was written in forgiveness, sealed by respect, and remembered in the hearts of those who understood what both men were truly searching for: peace.